The ship that docks at the Sicilian port of Messina in October 1347 has sailed from the Black Sea port of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean Peninsula, and it arrives carrying something that no manifest records and no customs official inspects. The sailors aboard are already dying. Those who are not yet dead are covered in black swellings at the armpit and groin, swellings the size of an egg or an apple, hard and painful, seeping blood and pus. And the Sicilian port authorities, recognizing that whatever is killing these men is not something they want to introduce to their city, order the ships out of the harbor immediately. The order comes too late. It was always going to come too late. The disease that moves outward from Sicily across the following 3 years is Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, carried by fleas that live on rats and that transfer to human hosts when the rat population collapses and the fleas seek alternative warm bodies. It is not the only form the plague takes. Pneumonic plague, transmitted through respiratory droplets, kills faster and does not require the flea vector at all. Septicemic plague, reaching the blood directly, kills so fast that some contemporary observers describe victims who go to sleep healthy and do not wake up. The combination of transmission routes makes containment essentially impossible in a world with no germ theory, no understanding of quarantine in the modern sense, and no mechanism for coordinating public health responses across the patchwork of political jurisdictions through which the disease moves with the indifference of wind. It moves through Italy first, through Genoa, Pisa, Florence, Venice, Rome, then westward through France, reaching Paris by the summer of 1348, and the English Channel by that autumn. It crosses into England in the late summer of 1348, works its way north through the following year, crosses into Scotland and Scandinavia, and arrives in the Baltic and Eastern Europe by 1350. It follows the trade routes, the roads, the river valleys, the sea lanes. The same infrastructure of commerce and communication that has made medieval Europe increasingly integrated and prosperous also makes it perfectly suited for the rapid propagation of a pathogen that requires only proximity between infected and susceptible hosts. The death toll is unprecedented in the recorded history of the Western world. Estimates vary because the record-keeping of medieval Europe is inconsistent across regions and social classes, but the scholarly consensus places the mortality somewhere between 30 and 60% of the European population over the period of the initial outbreak and its successive waves through the 1350s and 1360s. In concrete terms, a continent that housed approximately 75 million people in 1340 houses, perhaps 50 million by 1353. And that number continues to fall through recurring outbreaks across the second half of the 14th century. Some regions fare worse than others. Florence loses perhaps half its population. Some rural areas of France and England lose 2/3. Some regions of Central Europe and parts of Poland suffer proportionally less. But averaged across the continent, the Black Death kills between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2 of every human being it touches. These numbers are so large that they resist genuine comprehension. It is easier and more historically useful to think about what they mean at the level of a village, a manor, a guild workshop, a lord's estate. A village of 300 people in 1346 has perhaps 150 people in 1353. The fields that required 40 labourers now have 20. The lord's domain, the portion of the manor's land that serfs are obligated to work for their lord as part of their tenure agreement, requires the same cultivation it always has, but there are half as many hands to cultivate it. The blacksmith, who used to have 2 apprentices, has none, because both apprentices are dead. The miller's family has 3 surviving children where there were 7. The parish priest, who gave last rites to his parishioners, is himself dead, and his replacement is dead. And the third man to hold the position since the plague began is young and newly ordained and terrified. The church, the most powerful institutional landowner in medieval Europe, suffers disproportionately. Priests administer last rites, monks nurse the sick, nuns maintain the hospices. Their proximity to the dying makes the clergy among the most exposed populations in any community, and the mortality among religious orders in some regions exceeds 70%. The institutional consequence is severe. The church loses not just personnel, but the accumulated expertise, the administrative memory, the trained legal and commercial minds that have made ecclesiastical institutions the most sophisticated economic operators in medieval Europe. Monasteries that have managed their estates with centuries of institutional discipline find themselves administered by hastily ordained replacements who lack the training to enforce the old arrangements. The spiritual authority of an institution that cannot protect its own members from death, that cannot explain within its own theological framework why God would visit this level of destruction on the faithful, is also quietly damaged. A damage that will not manifest fully for another century, but that plants the seeds of the skepticism toward institutional religious authority that the Renaissance and eventually the Reformation will harvest. This is the environment in which the economic transformation begins, and the transformation begins from the most elementary possible mechanism: scarcity of labor. The feudal system of medieval Europe is built on a specific and durable assumption that labor is abundant relative to land, and that the surplus of workers relative to available agricultural positions gives lords the leverage to extract labor from their peasants on extremely unfavorable terms. Serfs in the feudal system are bound to the land of their lord, prohibited from leaving without his permission, obligated to work his fields for a specified number of days each week, typically 2 or 3, in addition to working their own strips of the open field system to feed their families. They pay fees when they marry, fees when they inherit land, fees when they grind their grain at the Lord's mill or bake their bread in the Lord's oven. They are not slaves. They have certain legal protections, rights to their own plots, customary obligations that their lord is theoretically bound to honor, but they are not free, and the unfreedom is enforced not primarily by legal sanction, but by economic reality. Where else would they go? There is no work for agricultural laborers outside the manorial system because there are more agricultural laborers than there are positions for them. The plague destroys this assumption in a matter of months. A lord who has lost half his tenants and faces unharvested crops rotting in the field because there are not enough surviving laborers to bring them in does not have the luxury of maintaining the pre-plague terms of labor. He needs workers. His neighboring lord needs workers. Every manor in the region needs workers. The workers who have survived know this because they can see with their own eyes the empty cottages, the untended strips, the desperate faces of men who hold authority over large estates and suddenly cannot find anyone to do the work those estates require. The survivors begin to negotiate, not immediately and not uniformly. The initial shock of the plague is not an environment that encourages economic calculation, and the first response of many surviving laborers is simply grief, terror, and the desperate scramble to maintain enough agricultural production to avoid starvation. But within a year or two of the plague's passage through a given region, the basic arithmetic of labor scarcity begins to assert itself in the most concrete way possible. Workers ask for more money, better terms, lower rents, longer leases, the right to leave one manor for another if the terms are more favorable, the freedom to negotiate rather than simply accept what the traditional customary obligations specify. Lords resist this. Their resistance is fierce and in many cases violent, because what the surviving laborers are demanding is not merely higher wages, but the dismantling of the social and economic system on which aristocratic wealth depends. A serf who can leave, who can demand payment above the customary rate, who can threaten to take his labor elsewhere if his terms are not met, is no longer a serf in any meaningful sense. He is a wage laborer, with a wage laborer's freedom and a wage laborer's leverage, and the lords of medieval Europe understand perfectly well that the economic basis of their class position is the captive labor of people who have no choice but to work for them on whatever terms they dictate. The English crown responds to the crisis in 1351 with the Statute of Labourers, legislation that attempts to freeze wages and labor conditions at pre-plague levels, requiring workers to accept the wages that prevailed before the Black Death, prohibiting lords from offering higher wages to poach workers from neighbouring manors, and establishing penalties for workers who refuse to work for the customary rate. The statute is enforceable in theory. In practice, it is a command issued to an economic reality that has already changed and cannot be changed back by legislation. A lord who refuses to pay the higher wage his workers demand loses those workers to a lord who will pay it. A lord who reports his neighbor for offering above-market wages invites the same report in return and gains nothing except a deteriorating relationship with the only neighboring estate that might help him at harvest time. The statute of laborers is vigorously enforced in some jurisdictions and quietly ignored in others. And over the following decades, the market reality defeats the legislative aspiration with the thoroughness that economic reality invariably brings to bear on laws that contradict it. Wages rise across the second half of the 14th century in ways that can be traced in surviving estate records, court rolls, and guild accounts from England, France, Italy, and the Low Countries. Agricultural labourers in England earn roughly twice in 1400 what they earned in 1340, in real terms after adjusting for the inflation that simultaneously affects the prices of goods. Skilled craftsmen, carpenters, masons, smiths do even better, because the same demographic collapse that creates agricultural labour shortage creates artisan labour shortage, and the skills required to build, to work metal, to produce the manufactured goods that both the surviving wealthy and the newly prosperous agricultural workers want to buy cannot be replaced overnight. An apprentice who would have spent 7 years learning his craft before achieving journeyman status finds his master dead and discovers that the guild is suddenly willing to negotiate the terms of his advancement. The guild system, the institutional framework that organizes craft production in medieval European cities, bends under the same pressure. Guilds are designed to control entry into skilled trades, to maintain quality standards, to manage the supply of trained craftsmen relative to the market for their products, and most importantly, to protect the economic position of established masters by preventing the labor market from flooding with untrained competition. Before the plague, guild admission requirements, years of apprenticeship, masterwork examinations, entry fees, serve as effective barriers that keep the supply of skilled craftsmen stable and their wages controlled. After the plague, guilds face a choice between rigidly enforcing their entry requirements and watching their trades collapse for lack of practitioners, or relaxing those requirements to admit craftsmen faster and at lower cost than the old system permits. Most choose flexibility, and in choosing flexibility they accelerate the very mobility they were designed to contain. Journeymen advance to master status faster. Apprenticeships shorten. Entry fees are quietly reduced for applicants with skills that the depleted guild desperately needs. The result is not a collapse of craft standards, but a broadening of the skilled artisan class. More masters, more workshops, more production, more of the commercial activity that feeds the growing urban economy. The urban economy responds to these pressures in ways that are visible across the major commercial cities of the 14th century. Craftsmen who previously earned enough to feed themselves and pay their rent begin earning enough to rent better quarters, to purchase better tools, to take on apprentices of their own, to accumulate small savings and invest them in the stock of their workshops. The surplus they are generating, the difference between what their labor produces and what it costs them to live, is not large by any later standard, but it is real in a way it had not been before the plague, and it creates something the feudal economy had almost entirely suppressed: disposable income in the hands of people who are not aristocrats. The commercial implications of this shift are profound and propagating. A craftsman with disposable income is a customer. He buys things beyond bare subsistence: better cloth, better food, furniture, tools of higher quality, occasional small luxuries. His wife buys things, his neighbors buy things. The market for manufactured goods expands, not because the surviving population is larger than the pre-plague population, it is dramatically smaller, but because the surviving population has more money per capita than any previous generation of commoners in European history. Merchants who supply this expanded market prosper. Artisans who produce for it expand their operations. The commercial cities of the 14th century, Florence, Bruges, London, Cologne experience the paradox of growing commercial activity, even as their total populations remain far below pre-plague levels, because the survivors are richer and the richer survivors spend more. The shift in the countryside is equally significant, though slower and more contested. Lords, who cannot maintain the old terms of labor service, increasingly convert their domain lands, the fields previously worked by serf labor obligation, to leasehold arrangements, renting the land to tenant farmers for fixed money payments rather than attempting to enforce the old system of labor rent that requires compliant and captive workers to function. The tenant farmer who pays a money rent for a defined plot is not a serf. He is a rural entrepreneur, working land he controls, selling his surplus on the market, negotiating his lease when it comes up for renewal. He has risks that serfs did not have. If his harvest fails, the rent is still due. But he also has autonomy that serfs did not have, and the autonomy includes the freedom to try different crops, different rotations, different production strategies that a serf working obligatory days on a lord's fields never had the incentive or the authority to attempt. The serfdom that characterizes Western European agriculture before the plague is largely gone in England, France, and the Low Countries by the end of the 14th century, not abolished by any single legislation, not eliminated by any revolutionary moment, but eroded piece by piece through the accumulated individual negotiations of 1 million surviving laborers who discovered, in the aftermath of catastrophe, that their labor was worth more than the feudal system had ever admitted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is the most dramatic episode in this long erosion, a moment when the accumulated frustration of a generation of laborers who have experienced their new leverage, who have seen the logic of the Statute of Laborers deployed against them with continued aggression, who face a new poll tax designed to transfer the cost of a failing French war onto exactly the social class that has least capacity to bear it, erupts into open insurrection. The revolt briefly seizes London. Its leaders, Wat Tyler, John Ball, articulate a vision of a world without lords and without serfdom, a world in which the labor that the plague survivors know is valuable is recognized as such by law and custom, as well as by the silent arithmetic of the labor market. The revolt is suppressed through the treachery of the young King Richard II and the execution of its leaders. But the conditions that produced it do not reverse. The serfdom that the rebels demanded the abolition of has effectively ceased to exist in most of England by the time the revolt occurs. The revolt is not the cause of the end of English serfdom. It is the symptom of an economic transformation that the plague made inevitable and that the ruling class spent decades failing to prevent. What emerges from the far side of the 14th century, from the demographic catastrophe, the labor upheaval, the wage revolution, the collapse of the manorial system in its traditional form, is something that has no exact name in the vocabulary of the era, but that later centuries will recognize as the beginning of a middle class. Not wealthy, not noble, not defined by birth or by the land they are bound to, but by the skills they practice, the capital they accumulate, the commercial relationships they maintain, and the modest but real surplus they generate above the cost of their own subsistence. The master craftsman with his workshop and his journeymen, the yeoman farmer with his leasehold and his market surplus, the small merchant with his trade connections and his credit relationships, the urban artisan whose children will have opportunities his parents could not have imagined. These people exist before the plague, in small numbers and in constrained conditions. They exist after the plague in larger numbers, with more money, more autonomy, more capacity to act as economic agents, rather than as the passive subjects of manorial lords whose authority rested on the captive nature of their labor force. The commercial revolution of the 15th century, the artistic and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance, the institutional innovations of the early modern period, all of these build on a social foundation that the Black Death inadvertently constructed. The plague does not intend to create the middle class. It does not intend anything. It simply kills enough people to make human labor scarce And scarcity of labor in a world built on the assumption of labor abundance changes everything downstream. The wages, the rents, the social relations, the commercial possibilities, the cultural ambitions of the people who survive. The most destructive event in European history since the fall of the Roman Empire is also, measured in terms of economic mobility for the people who survive it, the most equalizing. Not because death is equal, it is not, and the poor suffer proportionally more than the wealthy in most outbreaks, but because the survivors, regardless of their starting position, find themselves in a world where their labor is suddenly worth more than it has ever been before, and where the system designed to prevent them from claiming that value has lost the human infrastructure required to enforce itself. The dead cannot farm the fields. The dead cannot collect the rents. The dead cannot enforce the statute of laborers or maintain the customary obligations of the manorial system. And the living, discovering this, begin, slowly, contested, unevenly, to act accordingly.